The Moors are the Africans who civilized Europeans. And to this day, Europeans still can't get over it. They've spent centuries rewriting history, bleaching timelines, and pretending that their greatest intellectual awakening wasn't sparked by African empire. But first, who were the Moors? Let's break down the etymology of the word. First of all, Moors was used by medieval Europe, and they used that term to describe black and brown Africans, Berbers, Amazigh, and even Arabized North Africans, and sub-Saharan Africans, all from the region of Morocco, Mauritania, Algeria, Senegal, Mali, and parts of West Africa. That is who the Moors were. But here's the important part. Medieval European texts clearly describe Moors as black Africans. Early European texts include words like negri, which means black, moros, burnt faces, a Greek descriptor for African peoples, Ethiopian, which was a synonym for sub-Saharan African. The Moors were Africans. They were not tanned Europeans. They were not Middle Easterners. They were Africans. Europe's own records repeatedly, consistently describes them as black-skinned, dark brown skin, curly or coiled hair, broad noses, or African-featured, as they would say, and describing them as wearing African textiles, indigo dyes, and silk. Medieval art depict them with visibly recognizable, obvious African features, darker skin tones, and clothing styles tied to West Africa traditions. Europeans knew that the Moors were African. They painted it, they wrote it, and they feared it. It's only in the last 200 years, during scientific racism and colonial rewriting and colonial erasure of history, that Europe began to even whitewash the identity of the Moors. So, what did the Moors do? Well, the short answer, they rebuilt Europe from the ruins of its own instability. When the Moors entered Europe, Iberia, in 711 CE, Europe was drowning in famine, illiteracy, tribal wars, poor sanitation, and collapsing institutions. Within a century, Moorish Africa built one of the most advanced civilizations in the medieval world. The contributions that Europeans never want you to know about, education and literacy, that was the Moors. They brought in over 70 libraries in Cordoba, the largest library in Europe, housing 400,000 to 600,000 manuscripts. The University of Toledo, universities of Cordoba, Toledo, Granada, and Seville. Europe had monasteries. The Moors had institutions of global learning, science and medicine, surgical tools, the first hospitals in Iberia, ophthalmology, pharmacology, and advanced diagnostics, all brought to Europe by way of the Moors. Mathematics, astronomy, which powered Europe's age of exploration. He introduced street lights to Europe, indoor plumbing to Europe, paved streets to Europe, fountains, gardens, geometric architecture, and irrigation systems. They introduced over 300 agricultural innovations to Europe, all brought to Europe by the Africans. So why is Europe obsessed with erasing the identity of the Moors, their mothers and fathers of civilization? That's because of the fall of Granada in 1492. It wasn't just a military victory in Europe. It was a psychological one. Europe had been ruled, outclassed, out-intellectualized, overshadowed by Africans for over 700 years. And after the Moors were expelled from Europe, Europeans turned their insecurity into a global vendetta against melanin, a global conquest mission. because their age of exploration starts the exact same year that the reign of the Moors fell. That is not a coincidence. This is a never ending vendetta of retaliation. Europe's mission is clear: make the world forget who taught them, erase African influence, destabilize the entire continent, destroy African civilizations, burn African history, rewrite African history, claim every African innovation, and the most egregious of all, spread racial hierarchy globally. Petty AF. And today, Europeans are still terrified of admitting Africans built universities while Europeans were still illiterate, still afraid to admit that Africans mastered science while Europeans considered it hearsay, afraid to admit Africans brought hygiene to Europe because they were dumping sewage in streets. Africans preserved Greek knowledge that Europeans had lost, still afraid to admit that Africans ruled the Iberian Peninsula for 7 centuries because it shattered the myth and the lie of European supremacy. That's why they work so hard to sanitize the identity and the story of the Moors. They rather the Moors be Arab Mediterranean looking before they admit that the Moors looked like me. This allows them to grapple with their lie that anybody but the Africans, because they can never get over the fact that the Moors are the Africans that civilized Europeans. Cope.